Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Pat, for the invitation. Thank you all for coming on a cold night. As an author, you have a lot of book tour experiences that you can talk about. And one of my favorites is one that Tim remembers, where I was being introduced by the late Senator Paul Simon of Illinois. And he held up the latest book I'd written. He said, "Lester's written the sort of book that once you put it down, you can't pick it up again." My other favorite book story has to do with Liz Carpenter. Some of you may remember Liz was at one time Mrs. Lyndon Johnson's social secretary, and another time she was director of public relations at the White House. She wrote some of LBJ's better speeches. And after the end of the Johnson administration, she wrote a book entitled Ruffles and Flourishes. It was on the bestseller list. And she traveled about the country promoting it. And one night in Atlanta, Georgia, by chance in a hotel lobby, she met her former White House colleague, Arthur Schlesinger. And Arthur said, "Gee, Liz, that's a great book of yours. I really enjoyed it. Who wrote it for you?" She said, "Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, Arthur. Who read it to you?" Some of you may remember a book written by C.P. Snow. I think it was published in 1959 or so, entitled Two Cultures. He was a British scientist, and he was writing about the humanities and the sciences and the sort of the gaps between them. And in looking at the future, I see today two very different views of where the world is headed. One is a view held by natural scientists, by ecologists, hydrologists, meteorologists, and many others. The second is a view held by economists. When the natural scientists look ahead with hydrology, they see all sorts of problems with falling water tables and wells going dry. Meteorologists see all the climate problems. Ecologists see the wholesale breakdown and destruction of ecosystems and realize that we're on a path that is simply not sustainable for very long. Economists, however, see the future more or less as an extrapolation of the past. And this rests on a couple of key assumptions they make, one of which is that advancing technology will solve our problems. The other is that the market sorts things out. If one resource becomes scarce, we'll find another one to substitute for it, and so forth. And so when you look at economic projections for the world economy, for example, they all show, whether it's the World Bank or Goldman Sachs or Deutsche Bank or any of scores of other leading financial institutions, they all project more or less the same thing because they take the recent historical past, the last few decades of global economic growth, and simply project it into the future. And typically it's around a 3% rate of economic growth, which means the world economy doubles in 24 years. So the 2010 economy will double by 2034. What is there to worry about? But they never ask questions like, will there be enough water to double the world economy? What will be the effect on the demand for food of doubling the world economy and greatly increasing purchasing power? It's when you ask these questions that you have to begin worrying about the future. We are in the process of destroying the economy's natural support systems: forests, grasslands, aquifers, croplands, fisheries. And what we know from archaeological records is that no civilization has ever survived the ongoing destruction of its natural support systems, nor will ours. There's no way that we can stay with business as usual for much longer. For the early civilizations whose archaeological sites we study, like the Sumerians or the Mayans, food was the weak link in the system. And I had long rejected the idea that food could be the weak link for us. But as I have thought about it in recent years, I've begun to think that not only the food could be the weak link, but that food probably is the weak link. We are creating food bubble economies by overplowing and by overpumping. For example, there are now 18 countries in the world where water tables are falling as a result of overpumping for irrigation. These 18 countries contain over half the world's people. And what's happening is that in each of these countries, grain production is being artificially inflated by overpumping, which you can do in the short run, but not in the long run. And so at some point, you have to reduce the rate of, when the aquifer is depleted, you have to reduce the rate of pumping to the rate of aquifer recharge. So you get a downturn in the availability of water and in grain production. These food bubbles, these water-based food bubbles, are beginning to burst. The most dramatic one has occurred in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were self-sufficient in wheat for more than 20 years because they were pumping water from an aquifer that happened to be a fossil aquifer. That is, it does not recharge from precipitation. A fossil aquifer is like oil. When it's gone, it's gone. So the Saudis announced in early 2008 that their aquifer was largely depleted and they're going to phase out wheat production over the next 8 years. In fact, in the 3 years since then, their wheat production has dropped by 70%, and within the next year or two, it will disappear entirely. Now, that's a 3 million ton wheat harvest and a world harvest of over 600 million tons. So it's half of 1%. It's not big. That's a relatively small bubble. But the food bubbles in countries like India and China are much larger. The World Bank calculates that in India, 175 million people are being fed with grain produced by overpumping. In China, we estimate it's about 130 million Chinese being fed with grain produced by overpumping. And there are a number of other countries. But I don't think we've yet quite realized what's going to happen, what's beginning to happen in the world. But falling water tables is now becoming a major threat to the long-term growth in food production. One of the questions that comes up, and one of the questions, the principal question for writing World on the Edge, was to help understand the urgency with which we need to act. We don't have a lot of time to turn around some of these trends, like falling water tables. How much time do we have? No one knows. We've not been here before. But it now looks to me as though this tightening of the world food situation that we're seeing is an early sign of what may lie ahead. This tightening is largely a trend-driven tightening in food supplies. It's leading to dramatic increases in food prices in many parts of the world. On the demand side of the equation, there are now three trends expanding the world demand for food. One is population growth. There were 219,000 people at the dinner table tonight who were not there last night. And tomorrow night, there'll be another 219,000 more. That comes to 80 million additional people to feed each year. And at some point, that kind of an increase of that magnitude, begins to press against the limits of the earth's land and water resources and the skills of the world's farmers. We don't know how much time we have left. But one of the things that I do in the opening chapter of World on the Edge is ask the question, what if the Russian heat wave centered in Moscow had instead been centered in Chicago? We watched with a sort of morbid fascination the evening news for several weeks this summer, beginning in late June through July and into early August. We were watching Moscow filled with smoke. We saw the death rate in Moscow double because of heat stress and respiratory stresses. We saw by early August a country where there were 300 to 400 new fires starting every day. This was a country literally burning out of control, and the government just not able to cope with it. In the end, there was $300 billion worth of damages, at least 3 times the damages we suffered from Hurricane Katrina, for example. The Russians lost millions and millions of acres of forests. They were just gone. But if that heat wave, which reduced the Russian wheat harvest from the roughly 100 million tons they were expecting and hoping for to 60 million tons, a 40% drop, if that heat wave had been centered in Chicago, the U.S. grain harvest of 400 million tons would have been reduced also by 40%, or 160 million tons. If that had happened, there would be chaos in world grain markets today. A 160 million ton drop in the U.S. harvest would have dropped world grain stocks to the lowest level on record. And it would have raised grain prices to levels we cannot even now imagine, even though they're greatly elevated. And food prices in the last 2 months have set records for the world as a whole. One of the first things that would have happened is that grain exporting countries, in an effort to control food prices within their boundaries, would have restricted exports. A second thing that would have happened is that oil exporting countries would have begun to barter oil for grain in order to ensure that they got the grain that they needed. And then the lower income developing countries would have had to compete with each other for whatever might have been left. We are now seeing a loss of confidence by importing countries in the world market, in the world grain market. They no longer can assume that the market will supply their needs, as they have for the last half century or so. This is leading to a number of things, including land grabs, land acquisitions in other countries to produce food to be brought back home. There's countries like Saudi Arabia, China, South Korea, India. A number of other countries are now buying or leasing large chunks of land. By large chunks, I mean hundreds of thousands of acres or even 1 million acres and beyond. Huge chunks of land on which to grow food to ship back home. This current surge in grain prices is trend-driven, driven by population growth, which I just mentioned, by rising affluence, and by the massive conversion of grain into oil, i.e. ethanol, for automotive fuel. There are now roughly 3 billion people in the world trying to move up the food chain, consuming more grain-intensive livestock products. The third source of demand converting grain into fuel for cars, is taking over 1/4 of the U.S. grain harvest. Last year, we produced 400 million tons of grain in the U.S. 119 million tons went to ethanol distilleries to produce fuel for cars. So these three sources of demand now, population growth, rising affluence, and the conversion of grain into ethanol for cars, has doubled the annual growth in world demand for grain. So that's the demand side of the equation. On the supply side, we have climate change, we have falling water tables, bursting water-based food bubbles, and in some of the more agriculturally advanced countries, the plateauing of grain yields, grain yield per acre, which has been climbing for decades or even generations in some cases, now leveling off. This is true for rice in Japan. It's true for wheat in France, in Germany, in the UK. And it could soon be true for rice in China, because China's rice yields are now very close to Japan's. I doubt that they're going to exceed Japan's, and if they don't, then they too will plateau. So these are all trends that make it more difficult to expand food production fast enough. There's been a real surge in the interest in these issues in recent weeks, part of it fueled by the drought conditions in the wheat-growing regions of China, China being the world's largest wheat producer, and also in the southern plains of the United States. The climate change threat to production is also very real. The rule of thumb that crop ecologists use to assess the effect of rising temperature on yields is that for each 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature, we can expect a 10% decline in grain yields. And that was certainly borne out in Russia this past year. So the recent surge in grain prices is, I think, trend-driven. And unless we deal with the trends that are driving it, it's probably going to continue to be a challenge for us. In looking at the future, there are 3 indicators that I think will tell us more about our future perhaps than any others. One is an economic indicator, world grain prices. The second is a social indicator, the number of hungry people in the world. And the third is a political indicator, the number of failing states in the world. That's, in a sense, a bottom line indicator. We know that grain prices are high and almost certainly going to go higher. How high, yet we don't know. All eyes are on the next harvest, hoping that we get a really good harvest. But if we don't, if we get a moderate or poor harvest, things are likely to get worse. And I don't think we've yet realized just how tight things have become on the food front. One of the consequences of this situation, I think, is that it's going to force us to redefine security. We have inherited a definition of security from the last century, a century that was defined by 2 world wars and a Cold War, which is almost exclusively military in nature. When you mention the term national security now, people immediately think in military terms. But if you were to start with a clean sheet and start listing the principal threats to our future today, it would include climate change, population growth, spreading water shortages, rising grain prices, rising food prices, and failing states. These are the real threats to our future. And this doesn't just require a reconceptualization of what the real threats to security are. It also requires a fiscal restructuring that is responsive to the new threats to our security. We need to now think about how to cut carbon emissions quickly, and that means restructuring taxes. Lower income taxes offset that with a rise in the carbon tax. No change in the amount of tax we pay, just restructure, and doing this over, say, a 10-year period. That would, as the price of carbon went up, we would see a rapid restructuring and a reduction in fossil fuel use and replacement largely with renewable sources of energy. Closely related to climate stabilization is population stabilization. We have UN projections that world population is going to increase to 10 or 11 billion or so. I don't think so. What I'm not certain is whether those projections will not materialize because we accelerate the shift to smaller families or because we fail to do so and the number of hungry people in the world, which has been increasing now for the last decade, continues to increase and mortality rates begin to rise. That, I think, is our choice. The third component of what we need to do, this is 3 out of 4, is eradicating poverty. And that means working to make sure that we have universal elementary school education everywhere. It means making sure that we have at least rudimentary health care, including immunization to childhood diseases and so forth. It means school lunch programs in the poorest of the poor countries to get children into school and able to learn when they get there. And the exciting thing about accelerating the shift to smaller families and eradicating poverty is that once you get those trends underway, they reinforce each other. And it's not really as difficult as it may sound, partly because there are 215 million women in the world today who want to plan their families, but who lack access to the family planning services they need. We don't have to convince them. They know. They want smaller families. These 215 million women and their families represent most of the poorest billion people in the world. So filling that family planning gap would cost about this much. It is such a small figure, it would get lost in the rounding of our current military budget. But it's a gap that we cannot afford to have. Women need reproductive health care and family planning services everywhere. And the fourth component of what we call Plan B, the alternative to business as usual, is restoring the economy's natural support systems. It means, for example, adopting the sort of soil conservation measures we adopted in this country in the 1930s in order to get the Dust Bowl under control, to stabilize our soils. And we need that in many countries in the world now because there are 2 huge dust bowls forming, one in northern and western China and western Mongolia, the other in Central Africa. We can't afford to lose topsoil. As someone pointed out, 6 inches of topsoil separate civilization from civilizational collapse. We are totally dependent on that thin layer of topsoil. We need to be protecting it. How much does it cost to do these things? Well, first of all, cutting carbon emissions 80% by 2020, we would do by simply restructuring taxes. And that would accelerate the substitution of renewables for fossil fuels. The total of eradicating poverty, stabilizing population, and doing the things we need to do with soil conservation, reforestation, et cetera, comes to $200 billion of additional expenditures per year for the world. Now, $200 billion is a lot, particularly at this point in time. But it's less than a third of our military budget. And it does address the new threats to our security. And we also need to realize that today, there is no such thing as national security without global security. No country on its own can stabilize its climate. No country on its own can protect the value of its currency. No country on its own can control the international spread of infectious disease. That takes a cooperative effort. So the challenge is to recognize that security today, to be meaningful, has to be global in scale. What we're talking about is, in effect, saving civilization. We've got to reverse the trends that are undermining our future. Is $200 billion a year too much to spend to save civilization? I don't think so. How do you put a price tag on the future of civilization itself? I don't think we can. We have the knowledge. We know what needs to be done. We have the resources. We simply need to redefine security, not just conceptually, as I noted, but in fiscal terms. We can do this. It will take a mobilization unlike anything since World War II. Some of you have heard me say this before, but when I begin to think that the challenges are overwhelming, I remember, and I go back and look at the economic history of World War II. December 7th, 1941, the extraordinarily successful, in military terms, Japanese attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet, part of which was at anchor in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. January 6, 1942, President Roosevelt's State of the Union address, in which he laid out arms production goals for the United States. He said, we're going to produce 45,000 tanks, 60,000 planes, thousands of ships. And people could not absorb those numbers. They were so far beyond anything that we or anyone else in the world had thought of. But what Roosevelt realized, it was going to take an enormous effort to stem the tide in Europe and in Asia. And what he and his colleagues also realized, that at that time, the largest concentration of industrial power in the world was in the U.S. automobile industry. So after his State of the Union address, when he laid out the arms production goals, he called in the leaders of the automobile industry, and he said, because you guys represent such a large share of our industrial capacity, we're going to rely heavily on you to help us reach these arms production goals. And they said, well, Mr. President, we're going to do everything we can, but it's going to be a stretch, producing cars and all these arms too. What they didn't know was that he was about to ban the sale of cars in the United States. And they exceeded, and we exceeded, every one of those arms production goals. We didn't produce 60,000 planes, we produced 129,000 planes. Fighters, bombers, troop transports, cargo transports. Even today, it's difficult to imagine that. I remember being on book tour a year ago and flying into Seattle, Washington, where Boeing has its large manufacturing facilities. And I was thinking, 129,000 planes? I mean, even today, it's difficult to imagine producing planes on that scale. But we did it. That was 70 years ago. If we could do that then, we can restructure the world energy economy today. The point of that example is that it didn't take decades to restructure the US industrial economy. It didn't take years. We did it in a matter of months. And if we did that then certainly we can restructure we can restructure the world energy economy over the next decade. To back out all the coal-fired power plants in the world, for example, which would give us a massive cut in carbon emissions and a major step towards stabilizing climate, we would have to build maybe 2 million wind turbines, 2 megawatts each. That's a lot of wind turbines, but we produce 65 million cars a year. We're talking about 2 million wind turbines over the next decade. We could produce those wind turbines in the automotive assembly plants that are closed today. We could produce them for the entire world. So we can't say it's not doable. We have the knowledge. We have the resources. It'll require redefining security, but we can do that. And it's going to require leadership, and I think that leadership is going to have to come from this country. That's our challenge. I mean, we as environmentalists used to talk about saving the planet. But as I think about it, the planet's probably going to be around for some time to come. The question is, can we save civilization as we know it? That's the real question. And that is not a spectator sport. We can't sit around and hope someone else is going to do it. We have to do it. We need to become engaged. Pick an issue that's important to you. It can be closing coal-fired power plants. And we're making progress on that front. The first goal of the anti-coal movement in this country was to prevent the licensing of new coal-fired power plants. We now have a de facto moratorium on licensing new plants. The next stage is to close existing plants. And last year, US utilities announced plans to close 48 coal-fired power plants. This is in a country that has 600 or so coal plants. It's an important step, a major step in the right direction. And that movement is gaining momentum. Pick an issue that's important to you. Closing coal-fired power plants, stabilizing population, developing a world-class recycling program in your community, which saves enormous amounts of energy, or lobbying your member of Congress to restructure the tax system. Not to change the level of taxes, reduce income taxes and increase the carbon tax. This is where we're going to win or lose the battle. But we've all got to become involved. We all have a stake in the future. Thank you very much.
You are joining us. You are joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Lester Brown discussing World on the Edge, Preventing Environmental and Economic Collapse. I'll perhaps pose the first question, but those of you who wish to pose questions, please start lining up at the central microphone. I was struck in your description of what happened, in a sense, to the food system in a very short period of time. In chapter 12 of your book, you talk about the advances made since World War II in productivity, or I should say in production. Not so much productivity, but in the sheer volume of food produced. And a lot of it had to do with what was called the mechanization of agriculture, or the industrialization of agriculture, or something to that effect. And in a way, the success was far greater than we wanted. Because just as industrial systems move towards just-in-time production, we've created a food system that's now just-in-time production. And that's hypercoherent and very subject to collapse. Would we rethink the amazing advances that you outlined so well in the book, and that many people are arguing we need to extend, we need to make more efficient, quote unquote. The Green Revolution advocates are saying, oh, what we need now is a gene revolution, and we need to do what the Rockefeller Foundation and everyone else did in the post-war period. Now we need to expand that even more. Or would you be more inclined to say, well, we may need to rethink the just-in-time food production system?
Well, we do have consciously or unconsciously developed a just-in-time food system. I think the typical city in the United States, and this is probably true of many cities outside the United States as well, is that we have within our boundaries roughly a 3-day supply of food in the boundaries of our cities. And if there ever was anything that seriously disrupted that flow of food, and it could be something as simple as a very virulent flu epidemic, where the truck drivers wouldn't want to go out and drive trucks for fear of bringing the flu home to their children, so they would stay home, for example. And suddenly, the system would begin to unravel. There's also the question of global food stocks and security. The FAO, probably 40 years ago, developed a rule of thumb that said we need to have carryover stocks. That is the amount of grain in the bin when the new harvest begins. You never want to have just enough. You need to have a little cushion there. They said we need 70 days of consumption to provide a reasonable amount of food security. But that is when climate was stable. And with increasing climate volatility, what should that figure be now? And we haven't even had a public debate on the issue. But the more volatile the climate system becomes, the larger the food security reserves that we need. On the question of, you didn't use the term genetic modification, but that was sort of implicit in your question. Within the industry, there's a lot of talk about using genetic modification to double the world's food harvest or grain harvest and eradicate hunger and this sort of thing. But the reality is that the principal achievements thus far of genetic modification, and we've had 15 years of experience in the United States since the first genetically modified varieties are released, is one, we've dramatically reduced insecticide use on cotton. We have dramatically increased the use of herbicides on soybeans, and we have not achieved any dramatic jumps in yields. We may have gotten 5% here or 10% there, but no major jumps, nor do I think we will. Companies are now working on developing strains of grain that are more drought tolerant. We can get a little bit there. On developing strains of corn that are more cold tolerant, so maybe we can move the corn belt northward a bit. But these are relatively small gains, so I don't see any technological jumps that are going to make a huge difference in the world food situation.
Okay. You're joining us in the Cambridge Forum. The mic is now open for public questions.
Okay. Hi. Well, I'm extremely honored to be here in your presence. Thank you very much for all the great work you've done over the years. I have so many different things I could ask you about, but I guess my biggest concern is just that there's a lot of people out there that don't seem to be paying attention. There's very loud voices that espouse the economic viewpoint that you talked about, that we can fix our way out of all this, and those people are very loud in the media against any sort of fact-based discussion, and there's a lot of ignorance out there, and we do have the luxury of living in a country that doesn't have food scarcity or water scarcity. So I'm not very hopeful, and I'm wondering how you think we might have hope, and how we can have more education of people as to what's really going on. Because I can't even do it in my own family. Because my sister has 4 kids that she's raising to be consumers, and she just wants to go to Walmart and buy stuff cheap, you know? She doesn't want to know. She doesn't want me to talk about anything. I don't. So, there.
Let me start with your last question first, because in some ways it's the most interesting. As a country, we have never faced a serious food security issue. We've always had plenty of food. I mean, other countries have food security problems that we don't. But that may be about to change. I have an article on my desk in draft entitled 2 Food Scenario Nightmares. One was for the Chinese. They desperately want to avoid having to import grain on a large scale, but they're about to do that because they've run out of all the options. And there's every indication from analysts, not just me, but from many others, that they are going to move into the world market. Indeed, some things they'll be saying. When they move into the world market for large quantities of grain, they will come to the United States. Now, this is a nightmare for them. Keep in mind that the leaders in Beijing today are survivors of the Great Famine of 1959-61, when 30 million Chinese starved to death. That's left psychological scars that we can't easily imagine. But this is also a nightmare scenario for consumers in this country, because the prospect of competing with 1.4 billion Chinese with rapidly rising incomes for our food supply, and that will happen because we're far and away the world's largest food exporter, so China will come here. The idea of competing with them for our grain harvest, driving up our food prices, is not a pleasant prospect. And faced with something like that historically, as we were in the early 1970s, we restricted exports. In fact, we banned soybean exports to Japan totally, and we were their sole supplier. But we can't do that with the Chinese. They are our banker. They're our banker. Each month, the Treasury Department auctions off Treasury securities to cover our fiscal deficit. The Chinese are big buyers. They hold $900 billion worth of U.S. Treasury securities. Like it or not, and I don't think most people in this country have a clue yet, we're going to be sharing our food, our grain harvest with the Chinese, even though it may drive up prices at the supermarket checkout counter in a way we've not seen before. And I mention this because we feel sort of secure, as your comment implied. But I think that's going to change very soon, and I think it's going to be a wake-up call. And I think the idea that food security and climate change may be linked may also be a wake-up call. I mean, people don't understand very well the difference between 280 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere and 380 parts per million or 500 parts per million. I mean, you can't see it, you can't feel it. It's very abstract, but people do understand rising food prices. And that's where I think the change is going to come in public attitudes on this issue.
I'll leave after this follow-up, but don't you think that the media people are going to just use it for more reasons for people to be angry and deflect? I mean, there's so much deflection of what's going on. I just want you to address the media, how rational, fact-based information is going to get out there, and people will act on that.
Yeah, it's not always clear, but the internet, I think, is playing an increasing role now in disseminating information independently of the commercial media and independently of government controls, as we've seen in a number of countries where there's been political unrest. One of the first things they want to do is to bring the internet bring down the internet so people can't communicate information. I mentioned that in World War II, the automobile industry played an important role in winning the war, in effect. In saving civilization, I think the media are going to have to play an important role, not because they've asked for that responsibility, but because rapidly educating the public on some of these new issues that we're facing is going to take an effort by the media. They're going to have to be part of the change.
Hi, I'm Roger Schamel with the Global Warming Education Network. We last met in front of the White House on October 10th as one of Bill McKibben's thousands of events around the world, and we thought organizing a White House work party would be good to try and get President Obama to do more. In fact, we've been calling on him to make a State of the Climate address to level with the American people about how serious this is. And since you just mentioned in your talk that you think America needs to lead, and given the revenues that come into the media from the fossil fuel industry and the money that the industry and individuals are spending to confuse Americans, do you think it would be appropriate for President Obama to possibly even sacrifice a second term in office to save civilization and tell Americans the truth?
You've put the issue very well, and I don't know if I'll be able to see President Obama or not, but I'm going to try. And I'm going to make the case that it's not his second term that counts, it's the world his daughters will live in that he's going to decide one way or another. I think that's the issue.
Well, thank you. Please continue to do what you can.
Wow, hard to match what you have shared with us. I want to say briefly, we've been a fan of State of the Earth, Plan 3.0, 4.0, and now your latest, and I've already read it. I'm very aware that I have just retired, that I see that we have shared your latest document already with the people in our pool, you might say the converted. I'm similarly aware that I am very impressed by Amory Lovin's Reinventing Fire, the Rocky Mountain Institute, similarly Al Gore, The Inconvenient Truth. And the question I have, very simply, is I feel that these are separate things that haven't been brought together. Now, as a retiree, I'm quite willing to put $100,000 into play along with time, but I'm very confused as to where I should place it. I'm very impressed by our corporate public broadcasting, the Cambridge Forum, and they get heavy support from us, but we're in the Cambridge bubble. We don't have a Hitler or a Hirohito at this point to wake us up. And the question, maybe you're already seeing what the event might be, which is a catastrophic rise in food prices. But what can we do to accelerate so that the people who are unaware of this wake up? Quite willing to put money behind it.
I don't have a simple answer, but I would say that When I think about social change, there are three sorts of models that I use. One is the Pearl Harbor model, where you have a catastrophic event that changes everything literally overnight. If you'd conducted a poll on December 6, Saturday, December 6, 1941, and asked the American question, should we get involved in the war or not, 95% would have said no. If you waited till Monday, December 8th, and asked that same question, 95% would have said yes. Another model of social change is what I call the Berlin Wall model, where you have something gradually, resistance rising, and then suddenly it reaches a point where, I mean, the visual manifestation of that political revolution in Eastern Europe was the Berlin Wall coming down. That was a political revolution that changed the form of government in every country in Eastern Europe, and essentially without bloodshed. We didn't see it coming. After the Berlin Wall came down, the White House called in the heads of the intelligence agencies and said, how come you didn't tell us about this? Why didn't you warn us? Not only could the intelligence agencies, did they not anticipate it, they had trouble explaining it after it happened. And that's what tipping points are. You know, you keep pushing, and nothing seems to happen, and suddenly the wall comes down. The third model that I use to think about social change is what I call the sandwich model, where you have upwelling of support from the bottom and reinforcement of that support from the top. An example of that would be the 5 years from the March in Selma to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That brought huge change in this country. So I don't have any sort of magic formula. Let's just keep pushing. And at some point, the wall is going to come down. That I can assure you, if we keep pushing.
Thank you.
Thank you for your persuasive outline of the immediacy of the problem. I think it will become increasingly obvious, and I agree with you, that a mega Manhattan Project type approach is the only one that would work, given the immediacy of the problem. Some red flags went up for me when you seemed to assume that windmills were the preferred technological solution to the problem. I think, and a lot of other people think, that certain kinds of solar technology that involve cheap energy storage for 24-hour electrical production, irrespective of whether the wind is blowing or not, in a given place on the surface of the earth at a given time, is a preferred method. Now, what is needed to decide what the right choice of technology is in a situation like this is not only a new breed of economists, but a new breed of accountants and a new breed of engineers. I'm afraid that the engineering community is another community that lags behind the economists that you berated before. I think given a new method of appraising different technological solutions, we can make an intelligent choice as to whether we're going to go with windmills or solar. But we cannot go with the scattergun approach and the market mechanism to drive that scattergun. If we do that, we're doomed.
I didn't intend to say that wind is our only option. I was using that because it's an easy one to calculate, and it is growing very fast worldwide, more in China now than any place in the world, which is good news, considering how much coal they use. I think solar cells have a role to play. I think solar thermal has a role to play. I think geothermal has a role to play. And I think wave power, which is not as far along yet in technological and engineering terms, is probably going to play a role in some parts of the world. But the idea of running our economy largely on renewable sources of energy is to me a very attractive one. And one of the exciting things about electrifying the transport system, whether it's high-speed rail, intercity high-speed rail or light rail in cities, or plug-in hybrids or all-electric cars, is the idea that we can run our transportation system on solar energy, on wind energy, on geothermal energy. We don't have to have oil. And the idea of running electric cars on electricity from wind farms at the equivalent of 87 cents a gallon gasoline is economically a very attractive option. So I think the economics currently favor wind in many situations, not in all situations. There are some situations where solar is the obvious one, others where geothermal is the obvious one. And the trick for each country is to figure out what combination it has and how to move ahead. I could see Indonesia running its entire economy on geothermal energy, for example. But it has 130 active volcanoes. Not many other countries do. But that's an example. So it's not a set formula. I was using that to make the basic point that it's within our grasp to restructure the world energy economy and to phase out coal.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Christine. Thanks for being here. You mentioned before how there's a lot of grain that gets used for cars and ethanol. And what I'm trying to figure out is how come there's so much grain that gets grown for animal consumption. I mean, cows aren't made to be eating corn and other grains, and yet that's where a lot of the land is being used, and we could be using that to feed people instead of animals that then people are going to eat. And there's this big disconnect that I'm trying to, I just find it very perplexing that it's just, whether it's overfishing or factory farming, there's so much destruction on the environment that comes from that. How come, more isn't being done? I mean, people are like, oh, I'm an environmentalist. Well, why are you eating meat? And is there a way to kind of, make these two like one thing as opposed to, oh, I'm a vegetarian or I'm an environmentalist? If they both have the same idea in mind of basically like save the animals, save the planet, there's a way to do that in a cohesive manner. Because obviously, whether it's the topsoil, the methane, whatever it is, the water itself, I mean, there's so many different problems with it. I mean, what's to be done and why can't we do more to make people understand that there is this huge correlation between the two?
Your point is well taken. Roughly 37% of the world grain harvest is now used to produce animal protein in one form or another. It may be eggs, it may be milk, it may be pork or what have you. One thing to keep in mind is that it's not quite as clear-cut as it might seem. It's very clear that cattle in the feedlot is not an efficient conversion do not represent an efficient conversion of grain into animal protein. We need certain proteins in our diet. We need to have some high-quality proteins. They don't have to be animal proteins. It can be proteins from soya, for example. But if the choice is between consuming tofu or consuming catfish from fish farms in Mississippi, or poultry, broilers, the conversion of grain to, if you have a given amount of land, you can produce soybeans and eat tofu, okay? But that same land will produce about at least 3 times as much corn as soybeans, and at a 2-to-1 conversion rate, it's more efficient to convert that grain into poultry or catfish and eat the poultry or catfish than it is to eat tofu. I just mention that because it's not a complete advantage for high-quality plant protein over animal protein. Okay?
Hi. I'm very glad to have a chance to hear you. I admire your work.
So I'm an organizer, and I went to graduate school in environmental studies, and I've been grappling with this sort of division I've seen between the environmental community, which is largely academics, in this country, largely academics, and upper middle class people who generally take an advocacy approach to social change, so they lobby or they talk to politicians. And in the last few decades that I've been alive, there has been very, very little progress in terms of change with that approach. And at the same time, I see organizing happening at the grassroots level that's extremely successful in sort of local campaigns, efforts to get more funding for housing or more funding for healthcare or to get Obama elected. And that kind of organizing draws on millions of people and has a huge amount of power. But one of the main principles of that organizing is that it's connected to people's immediate self-interest. So if your house is about to be foreclosed on, then you have a great motivation to get involved with a movement to work on that. I feel as though in some ways the recession is an opportunity. A lot of people are very angry and have a lot of desire to participate in changing things. Is there a way that you see that we could connect that energy for social change with environmental issues?
One of the best examples of that at the moment is the anti-coal movement. The fire in the belly for this movement comes from local groups who are concerned about the quality of air they're breathing and concerned about climate change. And there are literally hundreds of these anti-coal groups across the country now. But they are being coordinated by the Sierra Club. They're not Sierra chapters at all, but Sierra is providing coordination, Earth Justice is providing legal support. And they early on discovered a formula that worked in the courts, which is when utilities wanted to build a new coal-fired power plant, they would challenge the utilities when they decided to build a coal plant that they had not done a least cost calculation. They hadn't looked at wind. They hadn't looked at investing in efficiency, for example. And because they did not do a least cost analysis as a basis for their decision when they decided to build a coal plant, court after court rejected it. So that became a winning strategy. And Earth Justice and Sierra used their legal skills to back the local groups in these cases. And it's been extraordinarily successful, probably the most successful environmental initiative in this country in a long, long time, and quite possibly in the world, because there were, in the early Bush administration, there were something like, 170 coal-fired power plants planned, but almost all of them have now been abandoned because of the opposition from these groups and from the use of highly skilled lawyers in challenging them in courts. So this has been a real success, and there is a website called, I think it's called Coal Swarm, that is a clearinghouse for information and experience of the movement around the country. You might take a look at it as a possible model.
Hi, thank you so much for being here and for your wonderful work over the years. The point I wanted to bring up was that the largest greenhouse gas producer in our country is the U.S. military. And the fact that the U.S. military is putting out all those greenhouse gases and at the same time spending our money so that we don't have money to spend on what we ought to be spending it on, which is research and implementing green energy for our future. The question is, what on earth can we do about this? It's so hard to try to convince Congress, certainly, or anybody in the government to reduce the size of the military, to break down those bases. We've got like 600 bases all over the world, and we spend more money than all the other countries in the world put together on our military. And it's totally counterproductive, and how on earth we were supposed to stop that, I don't know. It's pretty clear that the government isn't working for us, though, I will say that. So I'd like to hear your ideas on that. The
reason I said that one of the things I think we're going to realize soon is that we need to redefine security. And it's not military security that's going to save us. We have to deal with climate change and population growth, spreading water shortages, rising food prices, failing states. These are the threats to our future now. And it's this redefining of security, I think, that is the key to dealing with the part of the military problem you just mentioned.
If we can only convince our representatives and congresspeople that that's the case, that's a very hard problem.
That depends on you and me.
Yep.
We've got to go get them.
Okay, thank you.
Two quick questions, quickly posed. The first is, when you made your list of things we should be concerned about, one of the things that wasn't on there was sort of the global financial destabilization of financial markets. And I was just curious about why that wasn't on your list and how you think about that. And the second quick question is, are you worried about the bees?
On the first question, there is concern about the economic instabilities in the world today. Instabilities in fiscal systems and debts in countries in Southern Europe and international debt and imbalances, including the U.S. fiscal deficit and so forth. Most people are kind of aware of that. So what I was looking for is new threats, and threats that are fundamentally more important over the long term to the survival of civilization. I mean, we survived the bursting of the housing bubble. I mean, it shook the entire global system, financial system, to its very core. But we survived that. But housing bubbles that led to a 30% decline in real estate values in this country. But when the water-based food bubbles burst, it's going to lead to dramatic rises in food prices. And they will not be temporary. And that's why I focus on these issues.
And about the bees?
Bees. It now seems reasonably clear, I think, that pesticides are involved in the demise of bee populations around the world. And that means rethinking pest control. It may be genetic modification if that works, if it doesn't create other problems. It may be, there are all sorts of ways of managing pests that are not dependent on the use of toxic chemicals. But we haven't really invested very much in that because it's teaching new practices and management approaches in agriculture, and there are not huge profits associated with it, as there is in selling pesticides, for example.
Thank you.
Thank you for the honor to ask you this question. It has been my experience with my association at the Massachusetts Medical Society that anytime I present a situation that involves environmental issues, and I stress how pressing it is to be able to solve those issues, I can see in the audience that everybody is shutting down. And it occurs to me that in order to reach the majority of the population, we have to present a very positive solution and start with that and say, imagine a world that is in balance, where the citizens are responsible for their environment, where we have escaped this hurdle that we're facing now. And then maybe explain, these are the steps that need to be taken to get to this place. But it is possible, and frame it all in very positive images, life-enforcing, and bring it to a level of complete practicality with a complete blueprint, like you've said in your books, without mentioning so much the catastrophic consequences if we don't do that. This is something that politicians will be able to sell to their constituents, because then people vote for something positive. They don't vote out of fear. And I would like to participate in something like this. And especially if the media wants to be responsible, I think they will be able to sell a very positive, proactive, sky is the limit kind of thing model than what has been presented before.
One of the things that we do toward the end of the book is describe what life could be like in cities of the future. Imagine a city where there were no air pollution alerts. I mean, the idea that we've created cities where we now are urged not to exercise, on certain days because it's dangerous. But imagine a city where the transportation system is electrified and the electricity is coming from wind farms or geothermal plants or what have you. And where there are no internal combustion engines. No noise. Imagine a quiet, clean city designed for people, not for cars.
Well, these cities already exist. I mean, Venice is one example.
Excuse me?
Venice is an example of this, where everything is by water canals, and it's the most beautiful city in the world. So I think that's pretty much...
I don't think we have enough water to create Venices everywhere, but
right.
I get your
know.
point.
Yeah. But
right.
Anyway, thank you. But I think that's in creating a vision that will really trigger a response and say, oh yeah, no, that's it stays in your mind.
Thank you.
Good evening. You mentioned how carbon-fired plants have been closed down in the United States, and some of my personal experience has been that I've seen many of these coal-fired plants disassembled, nut for nut and bolt for bolt, and shipped to developing nations. So really, even though we're targeting the problem here, we're just shipping out somewhere else. I've come to think that nuclear may be an important part of the mix of different energies that we need to incorporate to get rid of carbon, especially in developing nations. And I do know that your stance on nuclear, you do take a bit of a step back. I'd like to know if with your new writing you have any different views on nuclear and maybe what they are.
The principal determinant of the future of nuclear power, I think it's going to be the economics. And nuclear is just not competitive. I mean, someone in the lecture at Harvard this afternoon mentioned France. Well, France does get, 70% of its electricity or something from nuclear power plants. But it is also true that France is building one new nuclear power plant and is planning 20,000 megawatts of wind generating capacity. For some reason, they're not staying with nuclear as the dominant source of energy. It's also, when I look at a technology, I often look to see what Wall Street is doing. Wall Street has not invested in a nuclear reactor for more than 30 years. And there's a reason for that. They're not economic. And so what the industry is now trying to do is to get government to guarantee loans made to utilities that build nuclear power plants in case they don't work out financially, that the investors won't be there. So there are going to be a few nuclear power plants built with that assurance. But it's because you and I as taxpayers are willing to pick up the tab if things don't go well. I don't think we can get by the economics. If we could, then there would be a chance that nuclear would work. But if you insist that a utility incorporate all the costs of a nuclear power plant, which includes, in addition to the construction, the cost of insuring it against risk instead of unloading it on taxpayers, the cost of disposing of the waste instead of unloading it on taxpayers, the cost of decommissioning nuclear power plants when they're worn out, then that's a fairly costly process. Nuclear just doesn't get out of the starting blocks. Think about, in this country, we have roughly 100 nuclear power plants, just over 100. The waste depository in Nevada, what is it? Yucca Mountain, would cost about $90 billion of taxpayer money. That's almost $1 billion for every nuclear plant built in the United States. If that tag had been put on the price, if that had been included in the price tag at the beginning, many of those plants would never have been built. So if we have full cost pricing and nuclear can make it, I'm prepared to think about it. But it's not close at the moment. That's the problem. There's also a political problem in addition to the economic problem. The political problem being, if we think nuclear power has an important role in the future, do we mean for all countries or just for some countries? And if just for some countries, who makes the A list and the B list, and who enforces it? And what you realize is that that becomes a politically unmanageable problem.
Thank you very much. I'm teaching here and in Suffolk.
Answers pretty soon.
And I wanted to bring up what you said. There is no national security without global security. Of course, that forces especially bigger powers, political and increasingly economic powers, to go into a redefinition of national interests and national sovereignty. So the Westphalian system of states, of sovereignty, will have to be reviewed systematically, further reviewed. But I wanted to draw the attention to your 20 failing states in page 21 of your Plan B book, and look at the human factors. We are seeing what's happening in Egypt. Of course, I'm not suggesting it should be a failing state, but I'm also wondering what you would say to Sudan, which you have on spot number 3 as a failing state, where we have seen a referendum, where we have seen 99% of the population voting for secession from the Khartoum government. Looking at the human factor, you talked about the fall of the wall of Berlin, and it was the human factor, it was people's power, like in the Philippines, like in many of these other situations in Georgia or Ukraine and so on. What would you give us tonight and others, how people could support people, not only through education, but to help that failing states which have a history? They are not failing for nothing. Of course, these central governmental structures are falling apart due to historical, but also due to political challenges.
We're leaving, and they may want me to sign their book, so
yes.
We probably should wrap up.
Yeah, if you would just give us some sense for the future on that.
In the last chapter of World on the Edge, the new book, we talk about what we need to do, how we need to rescue failing states. It's complicated, it's not easy, but that's what we need to do.
Okay.